Picture this. You are a boy of 9, born under the weightless sky of a northern village where winters gnaw the marrow out of your bones, and summer heat sinks into the clay walls of your family's hut, like it means to burn them from the inside out. Your stomach growls more often than it stills. Your father hasn't looked you in the eye since your sister died last spring. Your mother tells you stories at night, stories of dragons and emperors, of floating palaces and golden gates. But now her voice cracks in the middle of sentences, and she turns her face away when you ask what tomorrow will bring. You do not know what desperation looks like yet. You will soon. The man comes wearing silk and speaking softly. He tells your parents the emperor is generous, that the palace needs boys of good bone and clean skin, that there is honor in service, that one child's sacrifice can feed a family for life. He speaks the way people pray, with conviction and emptiness. He does not say the word, but your father hears it all the same. Eunuch. No one asks you. The agreement is made over boiled millet and bowed heads. You sleep that night with a knot in your gut, and when you wake, your mother is gone and your father won't meet your eyes. By the time the cart arrives, your fate is sealed with the sound of a chicken being killed behind the house. Quick, ugly, final. They take you far from your village, far from the dry earth and the bitter tea and the smell of your sister's old blanket. They strip your clothes and tell you to wash. They bind your hands in front of you, not tightly, but with enough ceremony that you understand what it means. From this moment on, you are no longer yours. The bathhouse is dim and wet and too quiet. Other boys are there, some younger, some already too thin. No one speaks. The walls drip with steam and mildew. The man who holds the knife is not cruel. He does not smile. He has done this too many times to feel anything now. He asks your name. You begin to speak it. He interrupts. You won't need it where you're going. They give you a wooden stick to bite and lay you on a mat of reed and cloth. Another boy screams nearby, the kind of scream that cuts through muscle, through time, through the part of your mind that hoped this was a dream. They tell you to be still. They don't wait for you to agree. And then comes the blade. It is not sharp enough. It drags before it slices. There is no anesthetic, just pressure, heat, then absence. A terrible pulling, a pain so deep it detaches you from your body. You try to cry, but you are choking. The world is made of light and noise and the smell of your own blood. You thrash until you are held down. You bite the stick so hard your teeth crack. You feel the blood run between your legs and slow, sticky pulses. You are 9 years old and dying. Or maybe you've already died. Somewhere nearby, someone is whispering prayers. Not for you, for the Empire. You wake to the sound of a fly buzzing near your ear. You're lying in your own filth, your thighs wrapped in old cloth soaked through with vinegar and ash. There is a bamboo tube jammed between your legs to keep you from sealing shut. You have not moved. You cannot move. When you try to sit up, you vomit. The boy next to you does not wake. You don't ask why. You already know. This is not a hospital. This is not recovery. This is sorting. You will either live or you will not. No one will call your mother. No one will mark your grave. If you die, they will wrap your body in reeds and throw it behind the wall where the pigs dig through the soil. If you live, you will spend the next days learning how to urinate again. You will be watched, not by doctors, but by other eunuchs, older boys, long since hardened into obedience, who will record if your urine flows, how much, how often. If your body fails this one final test, you will rot from the inside out. Your abdomen will swell, your bladder will burst, your skin will blacken and crack. You will die screaming, and even then, you will not be called a child. You will be called a failure. But if you survive, if your body learns to function again, despite what's been taken, you will rise, slowly, painfully, not toward freedom, toward use. You will be moved to a new room. You will be given a new name, short, impersonal, a number attached perhaps, or the name of a flower you've never seen. You will be taught how to bow, how to walk without lifting your heels, how to keep your hands folded at your waist, how to enter a room and not be seen. Your speech will be corrected, your accent shaved, your voice, high, still childlike, now permanent, will become a symbol, a signal, a warning to others that you are not like them, that you have no lineage, no desire, no manhood. And yet, they will call you pure. You will be trained to serve, not to think, not to ask, not to feel. You will learn the names of 1,000 dishes you'll never eat, how to fold robes for men who would have spat on your father, how to bow before concubines who look through you like smoke. You will be punished when you fail, and you will fail often, because your body was not made for this, because you were never given time to heal. You will learn to smile through pain, to stand without trembling when your wound reopens, to say thank you when slapped, and to kneel when spat on. You will feel your boyhood recede like a dream, distant, slow, unreal. You will remember your mother's voice only in the quiet moments between punishment and sleep. And one day, years later, you will wake and realize you no longer remember your name. You are 9 when the blade takes your body, but you die far more slowly than that. The real death comes later, quietly, invisibly, in pieces. And when it is finished, you will no longer be a child. You will no longer be a person. You will be a eunuch, and the palace will finally have what it wanted, a perfect servant, carved from fear, sealed in silence. They arrive in groups, on foot, in wagons, some led by the hand, others carried on backs too tired to hold them any longer. The boys are small, their eyes rimmed in red, their cheeks hollow. Some carry nothing at all, others hold sacks of boiled grain or trinkets wrapped in cloth, tokens of home that will be taken from them before the sun sets. No one here is noble, no one here is whole. They've come from famine-racked provinces, war-torn frontiers, river valleys where plague has blackened the breath of every third child. Their parents do not bring them to the palace gates with hope in their hearts. They bring them with a calculation so cruel it can only be called love. For many, this was the only way out. Castration was not always forced. It was not always punishment. In some corners of the empire, it was planned, discussed, budgeted for. There were families that had only survived this long because an older brother had already been sent to the palace and was now sending money home. His voice was never heard again, but his coin arrived with seasonal regularity, silver tucked into letters sealed by someone else's hand. And that coin was enough to buy rice through winter. It was enough to pay off taxes, to secure medicine for a dying sibling. It was enough to imagine that perhaps one boy's silence was worth it if it meant 5 others could live. So they brought them. Sons with bright skin and dark eyes. Boys who hadn't yet stumbled into puberty. 8, 9, 10 years old. Still young enough that the body hadn't hardened. Still soft enough to heal. Still unformed enough to be reshaped. They dressed them in clean tunics and wiped the dust from their brows before presenting them to the officials outside the Red Gate. Some had second thoughts. Some turned away, but most did not. Most bowed, handed over a registration slip, and stepped back into the crowd, never turning around to see if their child cried or watched, or stood in stunned silence as the doors shut behind him. And from that moment, he no longer belonged to them. He belonged to the emperor. The Forbidden City did not welcome these boys with warmth. It welcomed them with a ceremony of disappearance. Upon entry, they were not asked questions. They were given commands. Wash here, stand there. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't look anyone in the eye. Their names were removed from the official ledgers and replaced with numbers or aliases, recorded by low-ranking scribes who wouldn't remember their faces even a week later. Clothing from home was taken and burned. Any items brought with them, beads, wooden toys, coins sewn into hems, were confiscated and either stored indefinitely or sold behind closed doors. It was not theft, it was purification. A boy could not enter the inner sanctum with a past clinging to his back like dust. They were told to forget the village, to forget the voice of their mother, to forget the name of their older brother, the scent of cooking millet, the crooked path behind the rice field where they used to catch frogs. Forgetting wasn't just encouraged, it was survival. Any display of nostalgia was punished. Any mention of family was labeled disobedience. These were not boys anymore. They were instruments. And instruments did not grieve. Even among the eunuchs themselves, there was hierarchy from the very first day. Boys from more respectable regions, those with clear skin, symmetrical features, or voices that didn't whine, were treated better, assigned to quieter quarters, given instructors who used a soft voice instead of a stick. Others, especially those whose wounds had healed poorly or whose bodies remained weak after castration, were mocked, laughed at, called half-dead, made to scrub floors on their hands and knees until their knuckles split open from cold and stone. Some broke quickly. They refused food. They cried at night. They whispered to each other about escape. Those ones vanished, not killed usually, just reassigned to darker corners, to cleaning gutters, to shoveling ash, to being forgotten more fully. The message was clear. Even the memory of resistance would be erased. Those who adapted were still not safe. They were assigned mentors, older eunuchs who had long since traded kindness for power. These men taught them everything: how to bow low enough to please but not low enough to seem suspicious, how to walk without their feet making sound, how to carry porcelain without clenching their jaws, how to exist without appearing to want anything. Wanting, they were told, was a danger. Wanting led to questions. Questions led to punishment, or worse, dismissal. Because while the palace had consumed them, it could also spit them back out. Beyond the red walls, being a eunuch was shameful. No matter how many ribbons they wore, no matter how close they stood to the throne, no matter how many times they repeated that they served the Son of Heaven, they were still not men. They were not women. An identity that was not identity at all, but a limbo of public ridicule and private disgust. If one were ever expelled, if they failed their training, angered the wrong official, or simply grew ill and could no longer fulfill their tasks, they were cast out with barely more ceremony than a broken tool. No severance, no welcome home, no one waiting at the gate with open arms. Their family would not take them back. Their village would not feed them. Their temple would not bless them. They would walk the streets with their robes growing thin, their skin sagging over bones made brittle by years of service, and the children would laugh as they passed. Sometimes stones were thrown, sometimes coins, never kindly. So when they stood in line, waiting to be assigned their dormitories for the first time, when they were handed a number, a robe, a wooden pillow, and a square of matting on a stone floor, they did not cry. They bowed. They whispered thanks, because they understood what the palace wanted from them. Everything. And they understood what was waiting for them if they gave anything less. The palace gleams with perfection, but it is a perfection built on pressure. Its walls do not breathe. Its beauty does not bend. The forbidden city does not welcome its servants. It consumes them, slowly, silently, efficiently, grinding bone into posture, voice into protocol, thought into obedience. The roof tiles glitter like dragon scales beneath the sun, and the red lacquered gates rise taller than any tree these boys have ever seen. But within those walls, beneath that golden sprawl of corridors and courtyards, nothing is truly golden. For a eunuch, the palace is not a monument. It is a cage, a place too vast to escape and too structured to survive unless you fold yourself into something less than human. There are thousands of them, more than 5,000 at the system's height, scattered across every wing of the compound. They live like ants, ranked, divided, assigned tasks that intersect without ever overlapping too loudly. Each quarter has its own rotation, its own tone, its own pecking order. The palace is its own city, and within that city, the eunuchs are a shadow society, a secret engine running behind the curtain of silk and incense. The dormitories are sparse, rows of wooden platforms, rice-stuffed pillows, cold in the winter, stifling in the summer. Every morning begins before light, with a bell that echoes through the halls like a summons from the grave. They dress in silence, wash quickly, eat rice so bland it could be boiled paper, then scatter across the compound to begin their assigned duties. There is no chatter, no laughter, no questions. They move like breath, always present, never noticed. Training is constant, even after assignment. A eunuch is never finished being shaped. They are expected to master not just their tasks, but their presence. They must learn how to disappear when not needed and reappear precisely when called. They must control every blink, every gesture, every breath. To be too stiff is to seem suspicious. To be too fluid is to appear arrogant. It is a lifelong exercise in perfecting neutrality, a performance of personhood so precise it begins to erase the self entirely. They are watched constantly, not just by officials, but by each other. Surveillance is baked into the system. Older eunuchs monitor younger ones. Peers report on peers. Whispers are recorded. Deviations noted. A single misplaced object can become evidence of insubordination. A facial expression at the wrong moment can be interpreted as rebellion. No one is immune. Even those who serve the emperor himself are required to be watched by two others while on duty. Not to protect the emperor, but to ensure no one gets too close, and punishment, when it comes, is swift and public. The palace does not kill lightly, but it wounds with purpose. A boy caught speaking when he shouldn't will scrub floors until his knees swell like bruised fruit. One who looks too long at a noblewoman will spend a month in the cellar, chained to the wall and fed only gruel. And those are the light sentences. The heavier ones involve caning until the skin splits and muscle is exposed, or exile to the outer kitchens, a place so loathed it's spoken of only in metaphor. Everyone knows someone who vanished there. No one says their name aloud. Yet, for all its cruelty, the palace provides one thing none of them had before: structure. Out in the villages, life was chaos, storms, famine, warlords, debt. But here, in the hallways of gold and marble, everything has a place. Everything is labelled, assigned, measured. A eunuch may be mutilated, but he knows when he'll eat. He knows where he'll sleep. He knows what's expected. And in that brutal predictability, many find a kind of safety, even pride. Over time, the training begins to show. Boys who once trembled at every shout now glide across the flagstones with perfect posture. They wake without alarm, fold their bedding in flawless symmetry, recite prayers not out of belief, but memory. They don't speak unless spoken to. They don't raise their eyes without invitation. They don't react when insulted, when slapped, when accused. They've learned how to fade, to become less flesh and more function. And most importantly, they've learned to stay far away from the women. It is the first lesson drilled into them after survival. You do not speak to the concubines. You do not look at them. You do not acknowledge their presence unless ordered. They are the sun. You are a shadow. And shadows do not cast themselves across royalty. But the concubines notice them. They whisper when eunuchs pass. They drop small objects, combs, handkerchiefs, to see if anyone dares pick them up. A eunuch who smiles back can be accused of seduction. One who ignores a request can be charged with disobedience. There is no right answer, only risk. The women of the palace are caged too, of course. They live behind layers of curtains and protocol, guarded by walls that keep them ornamental and invisible. The eunuchs are the only men allowed inside their world, and yet not really men at all. And that liminality makes them both invisible and dangerous. Some concubines learn to use it, others hate it. Some develop quiet, trembling sympathies for the boys they once feared, but the system allows no relationships. Only rumors, only suspicion. And when a eunuch is caught in the orbit of a woman, whether by love or accusation, his life is over. So they avoid each other, pretend not to exist in the same space, like ghosts drifting through overlapping haunts. The boy who had once been told to kneel and keep his eyes lowered now walked the inner halls with a quiet authority that never announced itself aloud. He had no title, no family name, no voice in court, but he no longer needed one. He had become something else entirely, a fixture in the emperor's day, a presence so familiar and necessary that even the ministers who scoffed at the eunuchs behind closed doors lowered their eyes when he passed. Power in the Forbidden City was not always found in the throne room or the war council. It moved in whispers behind lacquered screens, in the soft rustle of robes gliding over marble, in the silence of men who had long since learned how to speak without making a sound. When the emperor stirred in his bed at dawn, it was not a general or nobleman who was first summoned, but a eunuch, one who knew the exact temperature the water must be for the emperor's morning wash, who understood the order in which the tea leaves should be placed, who could interpret a sigh before it left the mouth. This was not domesticity. This was access of the rarest and most dangerous kind. And access in a place where the spoken word could move armies or destroy reputations was power of the most intimate, untraceable form. The emperor trusted the eunuchs in ways he would never trust his wives, his sons, or his court, because eunuchs, in theory, had nothing to gain and no dynasty to protect. They had no heirs to promote, no bloodline to avenge, no appetite for women, wealth, or war. They had been emptied, made vessels for obedience. But the truth was far more complicated. The very things that had been taken from them, their manhood, their legacy, their sense of future, had left behind a void that did not simply accept subservience. It watched, it waited, it remembered. With no name to preserve and no honor to pass on, a eunuch's value was measured in what he could know and what he chose to keep. The most trusted among them, those who had proven themselves indispensable through years of silent devotion, found themselves drawn ever closer to the epicenter of imperial power. They stood just beyond the veil when the emperor wept over dreams he could not understand. They stood at attention when his rage boiled over and shattered porcelain against the walls. They bore witness to the soft collapses of power that happened behind the golden throne. In the hours between edicts and ceremonies, when the Son of Heaven was just a man haunted by his own authority, these eunuchs carried messages between factions, delivered confidential documents, administered punishments that could not be traced, and observed the shifting dynamics within the harem without ever making their presence known. Their memory was a living archive, containing knowledge that would never be written down. Who had spoken ill of whom, which official's wife had consorted with a rival envoy, which monk had predicted a flood and when. They retained every syllable, not as gossip, but as leverage. And when the right moment came, they knew precisely how to release just enough of it to bend a decision, to tilt the scales without leaving a mark. There was a profound irony buried in this arrangement. that boys who had once been mutilated to make them powerless now held the most sensitive threads of imperial life in their hands. It was never said aloud, but everyone who mattered knew it. The court feared them, the ministers resented them, the scholars condemned their influence as unnatural, but none could touch them, not as long as they stood close enough to the emperor's breath to feel its trembling. To betray that position was unthinkable, because betrayal was not punished with mere exile or quiet execution. It was met with ceremonial obliteration. A eunuch who crossed the line, who allowed ambition to overtake discretion, who acted for himself rather than the emperor, was not simply removed. He was erased. Publicly. His name stricken from records, his body dismembered in the square, his home dismantled, his fellow eunuchs forced to witness the destruction and offer thanks for the lesson. The court needed them, but it also needed to remind them they were expendable. And so loyalty was worn like skin, intimate, unquestioned, stretched thin over every action. A eunuch survived not by truth, but by usefulness. He could be trusted, not because he was believed to be good, but because he had proven he could be valuable. The minute that value faded, so too did the protections it afforded. It was a game of ghosts, men who had no past, who could not father a future, whose bodies had been turned into tools, standing invisibly at the hinge point of an empire's decisions. They were the ones who whispered when others shouted, who moved when others slept, who shaped policy not through argument or decree, but through presence, through quiet, careful suggestion, through the drip of memory over time. And for all their mutilation, for all their silence, they had become indispensable, not in spite of what was taken from them, but because of it. Not all eunuchs faded into the background. Some, through the perfect balance of submission and cunning, emerged from the marble shadows and silk corridors to become something far more dangerous, the emperor's favorite. These men, once children with blood on their thighs and no name left to call their own, rose through the palace ranks with such calculated precision that they became more than servants. They became architects of imperial will, powerful, untouchable, and feared by every man in court who still had the privilege of fatherhood. It began with proximity. To serve the emperor personally was to share his rhythms, his meals, his silences. A eunuch who knew how to pour wine at the precise moment his master grew weary, who could interpret a change in breathing or a pause between syllables, who could remember what no one else dared to write down. That eunuch became more than a companion. He became a necessity. And in the palace, necessity was the root of power. When the emperor began asking for him by name, when decisions slowed until he arrived, when other courtiers waited until he nodded before they acted, that was when the real shift occurred. The favorite did not speak for the emperor. He spoke before him. He would enter a room, bow so low that his nose nearly brushed the lacquered floor, and then rise with just enough pause to make the ministers present hold their breath. He did not issue decrees. He simply delivered the emperor's tone. A silence after a petition, a faint shake of the head, a soft word, later, which meant never. He needed no official title because his power was not carved into tablets. It was written on the faces of those who feared what he might whisper when the doors closed. Such power was intoxicating, but it was also fatal. Favorites made enemies fast. Ministers, generals, even princes viewed them as interlopers, their influence a mockery of tradition and merit. They would never say it openly, but behind closed doors they fumed at the idea that a man who could not even pass on his name might one day decide theirs. They accused eunuchs of manipulating imperial moods, of twisting the emperor's ear with flattery and lies. And sometimes they were right, because power in the Forbidden City did not live in honesty. It lived in advantage. The favorite learned early that to remain close to the emperor He had to serve not just his needs, but his paranoia. That meant identifying threats before the emperor even recognized them. It meant crafting rumors that removed rivals, timing confessions to stoke fear or gratitude, orchestrating events that reaffirmed the emperor's dependency on his chosen servant. It meant creating order not through force, but through choreography, one subtle shift at a time. And yet, for all their influence, these favorites lived every day beneath a sword. The emperor's affection was as fragile as it was absolute. It could curdle with a single misstep, a misinterpreted glance, a rumor whispered at the wrong moment. The same man who had once been trusted to choose the emperor's robes, to guard his most private letters, to oversee the selection of his concubines, could find himself shackled by sundown and dead by morning. The higher a eunuch climbed, the further he had to fall, and the palace never provided a cushion. Some fell slowly, undone by ambition. Wei Zhongxian, perhaps the most infamous of them all, rose in the late Ming dynasty to command more authority than the emperor's own family. He placed allies in every bureau, commanded military appointments, even built temples in his own name. For a time, he was not just the favorite, he was the shadow sovereign. But when the emperor died, so did his protection. The court turned on him like a pack of starving dogs. His statues were torn down, his name banned. Pursued by soldiers, he hung himself in a roadside inn, and even that death was not allowed dignity. His corpse was exhumed and mutilated, paraded through the streets as a warning to every eunuch who forgot his place. Others fell silently, disappeared overnight, dismissed, disgraced, poisoned. Their belongings burned, their names scratched out of records. No memorials, no family to mourn them. Their power had been real, but it was never meant to last. And yet more always rose. The emperor needed them. He needed someone who would never betray him with family ambition, who would never command an army, who could be controlled with favor and undone with a word. He needed someone who knew everything about him and had no one else in the world to protect. That kind of loyalty couldn't be trained. It had to be made, cut from a child, shaped through silence, rewarded with proximity. And as long as the throne remained, so too would the favorite, the quiet architect of imperial intimacy, and the man everyone feared most, not because he ruled, but because he knew how to whisper to the one who did. The harem was a world unto itself, sealed behind layers of gold latticework and crimson curtains, filled with perfumes that clung to the air like ghosts and silk garments so delicate they rustled like whispers in a dream. It was a place where beauty was cultivated like a crop, where hundreds of women lived in enforced luxury, dressed in jade and brocade, bound not by chains but by protocol. Their lives were measured by glances from a man they rarely saw, by the number of steps they were permitted to take in the garden, by the titles bestowed after brief visits to the emperor's bed. On the surface, the harem was serene, but beneath the silence, it seethed. And at the center of this gilded cage stood the eunuchs, gatekeepers, mediators, enforcers, spies. To the outside world, it seemed like a natural pairing. Eunuchs were the only men allowed inside the inner quarters, precisely because they were seen as harmless. They had no desire, no potency, no bloodline to protect. They could serve without temptation. They could observe without corruption. But inside the palace walls, every eunuch knew the truth. They were not trusted because they were safe. They were tolerated because they were useful. And nowhere was that utility more dangerous than within the harem. The women depended on them for everything. A concubine could not summon a physician, receive a letter, or learn of a court development without a eunuch acting as her conduit. Eunuchs delivered cosmetics, messages, clothing, and news. They recorded the births of imperial children and the deaths of rival consorts. They announced which woman would be called to the emperor's bed each night, and they reported back afterward how long she stayed, what she wore, whether she seemed pleased or upset. Their presence was constant and inescapable, and with it came a kind of intimacy that was both comforting and menacing. Some eunuchs developed close bonds with the women they served. They became confidants, protectors, even surrogate family. They listened to confessions whispered under moonlight, bore witness to jealousies, miscarriages, affairs. They offered advice, delivered favors, brokered small mercies within a system that allowed few. But affection in the harem was a dangerous currency. Even the smallest suggestion of favoritism could spark rumors, and rumors, in a place where power hung on a thread, were lethal. The women were not naive. They understood the precarious balance. They knew the eunuchs were both lifelines and liabilities. Some learned to manipulate them, offering bribes, flattery, even staged vulnerability to secure influence. A single eunuch, if well placed and well incentivized, could destroy a rival's standing. One fabricated report about illness, disobedience, or infidelity could lead to punishment, exile, even execution. The stakes were life and death, and both women and eunuchs played the game with a delicacy sharpened by desperation. But betrayal ran both ways. A eunuch who aligned himself too closely with a woman risked his own life. If a favored concubine fell out of grace, everyone associated with her fell with her. There were eunuchs who were imprisoned simply for delivering the wrong letter. Others were tortured into confessing to imagined plots, accused of seduction, despite their mutilated bodies. In rare, horrifying cases, they were executed alongside the women they served, beheaded in the gardens where they once fetched water, buried in unmarked graves behind the wall. The line between servant and conspirator was always razor thin. This ambiguity bred a climate of suspicion that never lifted. Every glance was watched, every whisper weighed. When concubines quarreled, it was the eunuchs who were interrogated. When tensions rose in the court, it was the eunuchs who were blamed for stirring unrest behind closed doors. And while some wielded this perception like a blade, using fear to cement their authority, most walked with caution. They learned to bow lower, to speak more softly, to make their presence so indispensable that no one could afford to question them too harshly. And still, some did. There were ministers who accused the harem eunuchs of interfering with state matters, of using their positions to influence imperial decisions through pillow talk and poison. At times, the court responded with purges. Entire wings of the palace cleared out, eunuchs dismissed or executed, the ranks refilled with fresh boys from distant provinces, as if memory itself could be wiped away through turnover. But the system always regenerated. The structure demanded its gatekeepers, because the emperor could not walk the harem halls unaccompanied. He could not tend to hundreds of women, raise children, manage the inner court. He needed men who could move between chambers without causing scandal, who could serve without threatening lineage, who could monitor the most volatile part of palace life while being considered too mutilated to matter. It was an impossible role, to guard women they could never touch, to speak for masters who never listened, to carry secrets they could never share, to live in the heart of luxury while never being allowed to want. They stood beside jewels they would never own, inhaled perfumes they could never associate with intimacy, delivered children they would never hold as fathers. And they endured, not because the role was dignified, but because it was the only place they could not be cast out from without vanishing entirely. The harem may have belonged to the emperor, but it ran on eunuchs, and the empire trusted them to keep its most delicate world intact, not out of respect, but out of necessity, a necessity born of fear. There is a line that every eunuch learns to walk, though no one speaks of it openly. It is the line between service and rule. between being the silent shadow that fetches ink and the hidden hand that moves an empire. And as the centuries wore on and dynasties waxed and waned, as emperors aged or weakened, distracted by concubines or tormented by omens, some eunuchs learned how to step over that line and do what no one ever intended them to do. Govern not from a throne, but from behind it. The temptation was inevitable. These men, castrated in childhood and denied the simplest rights of legacy and freedom, stood at the nerve center of power with no illusions left to shatter. They knew how the court functioned, where its weaknesses festered, which ministers drank too much, which generals carried debts, which concubines resented their place in the hierarchy. And unlike the bureaucrats who rotated in and out of service with each change of reign, the eunuchs stayed. They remembered. They endured. They buried emperors and served their sons, witnessed secrets that never reached paper, and carried grudges that stretched across decades. In a system where knowledge was power, they became not merely servants of the state, but keepers of the state's soul. And once power is tasted, even by those who once had everything taken from them, it becomes harder to surrender than to survive. Some eunuchs began to exert influence not just behind the curtain, but beyond it. They selected officials, blocked petitions, delayed edicts, and quietly reshuffled the machinery of empire until it responded to their rhythms more than the emperors. They grew wealthy, not through open graft, but through clever patronage and private networks of obligation. They placed relatives of trusted allies in key provincial posts, reaped tributes disguised as tokens of gratitude, skimmed coins from the silver that flowed through the palace accounts like blood in a body already showing signs of fever. The court noticed, of course, and it resented them for it. Ministers who had trained their whole lives to wield influence found themselves hemmed in by men who had never passed an exam, who wore no scholarly robes, who signed no documents, but whose words carried more weight than theirs ever could. And so, behind closed doors, the scholar officials fumed and plotted and compiled secret dossiers, whispering to one another about corruption and decay, hoping that the next emperor would be strong enough or angry enough to act. But for every whisper of reform, there was an example of failure. Because the moment an emperor tried to purge the eunuchs, he discovered that his own household, his guards, his daily life, had been so thoroughly interwoven with their presence that to remove them was to tear the sinews from his own limbs. The food stopped arriving on time, the documents were misfiled, the gates opened too late or too early, servants disappeared, spies multiplied. The palace, which once hummed with orchestrated precision, stumbled, and in that chaos, the emperor found himself increasingly isolated, surrounded not by loyalists, but by men who feared the eunuchs more than they revered the throne. The greatest of these power brokers became legends of both fear and fascination. Wei Zhongxian, who ruled in the name of the child emperor Tianqi, oversaw a reign of terror so thorough that his enemies were not just removed, they were erased. Names disappeared from lineage scrolls. Families were exiled, executed, obliterated. Wei controlled appointments, issued decrees through the boy emperor, reshaped the palace as a monument to himself, and even rewrote history books to include his own name in sacred rituals. He was not a man, not even a villain in the traditional sense, but a living warning of what happened when mutilated hands were allowed to grasp for too much. And yet, for every Wei, there were hundreds of others, less famous but no less dangerous, who operated in shadows just deep enough to avoid scrutiny. Some traded information like currency, collecting secrets the way others collected jade, always waiting for the perfect moment to spend their knowledge for influence. Others ruled entire departments in the palace with an iron quietness. Their orders followed with more precision than any decree from a distracted sovereign. They were feared by commanders, resented by governors, and envied by every official who watched these childless men accumulate riches, power, and status without ever once sitting for an exam or spilling blood in battle. But what the eunuchs gained, they always knew could be taken away, so they guarded their power with a paranoia sharpened by centuries of violence. They turned against one another, sowing rivalries within the ranks, betraying colleagues to avoid suspicion, sacrificing even friends when necessary. And when purges came, and they always came, those who survived did so not through innocence, but through calculation. They had anticipated the betrayal. They had prepared escape routes. They had buried the evidence. They had known that in the end, the system did not hate corruption. It hated competition. And so, the palace continued to feed upon itself, burning through generations of eunuchs who rose too high or sank too low, always recycling the same story. A servant elevated, a court enraged, an emperor humiliated, a purge unleashed, a silence restored. But even after the fires had cooled and the executions had ended, new boys arrived. New names were stripped away. New loyalties were cultivated. And once again, in the quiet chambers where the true levers of power were pulled, someone new learned how to wait, how to listen, how to control. Because in the Forbidden City, even a man with nothing left could learn to rule everything. There is a breaking point for every system, no matter how polished its rituals, how gilded its halls, or how tightly it holds its grip on silence. And in the Forbidden City, this sacred prison of red walls and jade lions, where eunuchs had long been tolerated, then feared, then secretly obeyed, the cracks had already begun to spider beneath the lacquer. The dynasty's outward calm belied an inner sickness, one that no longer flowed through emperors alone, but now festered in the staff that surrounded them. When power is built on proximity rather than legitimacy, on whispers rather than law, its fall is not a coup, it is a slow, festering collapse from within. By the late Ming and into the Qing, the eunuch class had reached a scale and complexity that overwhelmed its original design. What had once been a system of quiet, invisible stewards had swelled into a bureaucracy of thousands, an empire within the empire, where each palace function, from the lighting of ceremonial lamps to the scrutiny of memorial scrolls, passed through eunuch hands. And with this growth came the inevitable: resentment, rivalry, and rot. The younger eunuchs, freshly cut and trembling from the trauma of their entry, watched the older ones maneuver with a control that was terrifying in its elegance. They saw men who had nothing ascend to roles of influence that made provincial governors bow at their feet. And they began to want it too. Ambition breeds factions, and factions breed chaos. What had once been a single chain of obedience fractured into nests of loyalty, each group protecting its own, each guarding its influence over a specific wing of the court. Some controlled access to the emperor's food, others to his daily documents, still others to the movement of concubines or the supervision of imperial tombs. These invisible fiefdoms clashed like tectonic plates beneath the palace floors, not openly, never openly, but in slow-burning conflicts, missing documents, failed rituals, intercepted messages, forged appointments. The court would feel the effects, but never see the blade. By the time ministers suspected sabotage, it was too late. The eunuchs had grown skilled not just in service, but in deception. Rebellion did not come from the armies outside the walls. It began in the kitchens, in the scroll rooms, in the private apartments where the emperor's most sacred routines were administered by men who could no longer remember who they once were. There were rumors that some eunuchs began withholding food to punish rivals, slipping subtle poisons into wine to settle scores, manipulating the order of which consorts were selected each night to favor one political faction over another. It was not murder, it was rebalancing. In a world where visibility meant death and direct power invited execution, These quiet insurrections were the only language they were permitted to speak. The emperor often saw none of this, or perhaps he did, and simply couldn't face it. Some rulers, old or indifferent, allowed the eunuchs to continue their shadow rule simply because to remove them would mean re-engineering the entire palace from the ground up. The officials brought in to advise reform were always met with resistance, not from the eunuchs themselves, who never raised their voices, but from the machinery they controlled. Edicts went missing. Messengers were delayed. Reports were edited before they reached the throne. It was like shouting into a room padded with silk. Every command swallowed before it could reach its target. Eventually, uprisings became inevitable. One of the most infamous occurred during the final years of the Ming, when palace eunuchs, aware of the dynasty's collapse, began to secure their own futures by hoarding wealth, smuggling treasures out of the vaults, and quietly negotiating with enemy forces. Some turned informants, others bribed invaders. It was not loyalty that drove them anymore, but survival. The empire had used their bodies and silenced their pasts, and now, at the end, it offered them nothing in return. So they carved out what they could, not with swords, but with silence. And when the dynasty finally fell, as the banners of the Qing were raised above the palace walls, the eunuchs did not die defending the gates. They opened them, not out of betrayal, but because they understood better than anyone how history works. Empires do not fall in war. They fall in whispers, and they had whispered for generations. What remained after the fall was not a legacy of service, but a legacy of resentment, of desperation, of men mutilated in youth who became masters of secrets, whose only mistake was daring to believe that the empire they held together with invisible hands might one day thank them. But it never did. And so they learned that no amount of obedience, no depth of silence, no loyalty soaked in blood could earn them more than blame when it all went wrong. The dynasty was gone, but the walls remained. The forbidden city, once a furnace of whispers and gold-draped violence, now echoed with the absence of authority. The emperor no longer ruled from his dragon throne, but still the eunuchs moved through the halls like ghosts who had forgotten how to die. They continued to sweep the courtyards, to light the incense, to unlock doors no one entered anymore. Their rituals had outlived their purpose, and yet they could not stop. Because for them, routine was not just duty, it was the last thread of identity they still possessed. When the Qing dynasty collapsed in the early 20th century, the eunuchs were not dismissed all at once. No trumpet announced the end of their relevance. Instead, they lingered, year by year, in an empire that no longer existed, performing tasks for emperors who had become private citizens. Puyi, the last emperor of China, was just a boy when he was dethroned, yet he still held court within the palace as a kind of ghost monarch, and the eunuchs stayed by his side, tending to his whims as if the world had not changed beyond the red walls. They shaved their heads in the traditional style. They wore the same robes. They opened the same gates each morning. But outside, the Republic had been born. Warlords were carving up provinces. Foreign soldiers walked through Beijing. Radios crackled in tea shops with news of revolution. And still, inside the palace, these men with no past and no future performed ancient duties with hands that trembled from age or illness or grief. Some of the eunuchs were in their 70s or 80s. They had entered the palace as boys, led by the hand of fathers who could no longer afford to feed them. Many could no longer remember the sound of their mother's voice. Their childhoods had been traded for silk slippers and blood-soaked cloth. And now, after a lifetime of watching emperors come and go, they were left with nothing. Not even contempt. Just irrelevance. The new governments viewed them as relics, pitiful at best, at worst, parasites. Some were evicted from the palace and forced into the streets, their backs permanently bowed from decades of deep ceremonial bows. Others were kept on for a time in ceremonial roles, treated more like living antiques than men. They posed for photographs they didn't understand. They recited prayers to a sky that had already forgotten them. And when the New Republic finally took control of the Forbidden City entirely, they were dismissed in waves, unpaid, unrecognized, unrecorded. Outside the palace, they became curiosities. Some worked as tour guides in their old age, walking tourists through rooms they once guarded with silent devotion, now reduced to trivia and half-translated anecdotes. Others sold trinkets or became beggars, recognized only by their voices. Thin and high, the lifelong effect of castration, mocked by children who had no idea what had been taken from them to make them sound that way. A few turned to crime. Without pensions, family, or property, they survived by pawning off palace relics. Scrolls, robes, porcelain teacups, sacred texts once entrusted to their care. Some stole from former colleagues. Some were beaten or arrested. But most simply faded, their lives dissolving into alleys and back rooms and forgotten hospice beds. They left behind no heirs, no graves marked by sons or daughters. Their names were barely written, let alone remembered. And yet, they had shaped the fate of dynasties. They had held emperors while they wept, smuggled secrets that decided wars, opened doors that changed history. Their hands had lit the candles at 1,000 rituals. Their feet had walked more miles within those palace walls than any general ever marched in the name of the empire. But in the end, all that remained was silence. Not the silence of reverence, but the silence of neglect. One of the last known imperial eunuchs, Sun Yolting, lived until 1996. He gave interviews in his final years, sitting in a faded robe with tears in his eyes, remembering a time when his life had purpose, even if that purpose was born in agony. He spoke of the moment the surgeon cut him, how he was held down, how he screamed, how his father cried outside the door and then told him to be strong. He spoke of emperors who never looked him in the eye, of concubines who whispered their secrets to him like confessions to a priest, of palace officials who begged for his silence on their deathbeds. And then he spoke of now, of a world with skyscrapers and electric lights, where no one remembered the rituals of incense and midnight audiences, where boys no longer knew what it meant to be turned into a tool before they learned how to read. He wept, not because he wished it would return, but because it had all disappeared without anyone ever truly understanding it. What the eunuchs had endured, what they had carried, what they had lost. They were the invisible thread that held the tapestry together, and when the tapestry finally unraveled, no one thought to honor the thread. They simply swept it away. Today, the Forbidden City stands as a museum. Its ancient stones worn smooth by the feet of tourists, its courtyards filled with the chatter of school groups, selfie sticks, the click of camera shutters. The throne room is roped off. The royal bedchambers are dusted weekly. The lanterns that once flickered in the stillness of midnight ceremonies now hang motionless under fluorescent lights. And in the shadows where eunuchs once stood, watching, waiting, knowing, they are no longer there. Only echoes remain, and most visitors walk past them without noticing. There are no memorials to the eunuchs, no statues, no shrines, no plaques carved with names or stories. The emperors are remembered, the generals are lionized, the concubines are mythologized. But the men who bled at 9 years old, who gave their bodies to a system that promised only silence in return, are barely footnotes, described in tour books as curiosities, as an interesting tradition, as if they were customs instead of human beings. What was taken from them cannot be listed in full. It was not just flesh, or lineage, or desire. It was childhood. It was the right to choose. It was the possibility of becoming something other than a shadow. Castration was only the beginning. What followed was a life of ritualized erasure, a slow transformation into a tool, a vessel, a symbol of submission so complete that many forgot what it felt like to be a person at all. And yet they endured, not because they believed in the empire's glory or in the divinity of the man they served, but because they had to. Because once you have been broken, once your entire identity has been replaced by obedience, there is no way back. You learn to live inside the performance. You become the silence. You become the presence that waits behind every door, that smooths every fold in the emperor's robe, that kneels without question as others decide the course of history. They kept the empire alive, quietly, invisibly. They moved papers, settled disputes, read expressions the way others read weather. They ensured that when the emperor looked out at his world, it looked back exactly as it should. And when he wept, when he faltered, when he died, they were the ones who prepared the body. They knew everything, and they died with it. No lineage mourned them. No biographers chased their truths. The last of them passed into death with the same silence they had practiced since childhood, as if even their endings were not theirs to own. But the weight of their suffering is still here, folded into the corners of red walls, lingering in the stillness of sealed doors. If you listen closely, truly listen, you might hear it. A breath behind you in an empty hall. A footstep in the dark. The soft clink of beads brushing against a silk robe that no longer moves. That is what remains. Not their names, but their absence. Not their glory, but their sacrifice. And perhaps one day, when we speak of empires and emperors, we will also speak of the boys who were cut to serve them, who smiled when commanded, who sang when ordered, who died without descendants, so the throne could remain pure, untouched by threat, untouched by love. They were not kings. They were not soldiers. They were not fathers. But they held up a world that never held them back. And for that, they deserve to be remembered, not as symbols of tradition, but as the clearest, quietest evidence of how power consumes, and how even silence leaves scars that stretch across centuries.